am the most authentic Dracula ever. So saith my mustache. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another Halloween horror movie review. Today we're going to talk about Count Dracula from 1970, starring Christopher Lee, but it's actually not a Hammer film, believe it or not, and directed by Jess Franco. Now, this one was a pretty big deal when it came out, because one of the big things they advertised about it was that this is the first time the real Dracula was being brought to film. Yes, the 100% faithful to the book adaptation for the first time ever. So is it? Well, let's talk about it today on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. Now, of course, by this point, 1970, Christopher Lee had been playing Dracula for about 12 years, since 1958's Horror of Dracula, and had made quite a name for himself as the Count. So it was quite a coup for Jess Franco to be able to convince him to step away from Hammer for a film and do this one. And one of the things that attracted Christopher Lee to the role was the fact that they were saying that they were going to be doing the real story. Now, Christopher Lee was very well read, and he loved classic literature, and he was quite familiar with the original book of Dracula. So this naturally enticed him. And he said in an interview that I listened to recently that one of the things that convinced him was the fact that this Dracula would have a mustache. Whereas, in the book he has facial hair. He has a mustache. And no other Dracula has ever had a mustache. I think there's been a few over the years, but none of the major ones that everybody remembers. Oh, wait a minute. No, 1992, the Francis Ford Coppola one. He did have a mustache in that for at least some of the scenes. We'll talk about that when we get to it. It's complicated. So this was the first time we'd ever had the facial hair Dracula. So that was a pretty big deal, and one of the big things that convinced Christopher Lee to do it. Now, of course, the big question is it as faithful to the book as the marketing materials would have us believe? Well, honestly, it starts off pretty darn faithful. Like the whole sequence with Jonathan Harker going to the castle and meeting Dracula, it's pretty faithful to the book. So it begins much like many Dracula movies with Jonathan Harker arriving at the castle. After being warned not to go to the castle by some frightened villagers. He goes anyway. It is Dracula driving the carriage, by the way. Takes him to the castle, greets him at the door, and says the famous line, "Enter freely, and of your own will." That line has always struck me as kind of the reverse of the whole thing where a vampire can't enter your home unless he is invited. So it's like he is inviting Harker into his home under the same conditions. It's almost like he's I don't know, consciously or unconsciously obeying the same rule. It's like no one can enter my home unless I invite them, which of course is wrong. That only applies to vampires, and only in certain versions of the story. So it seems like throughout the movies a lot more vulnerabilities have been introduced to vampires. You can't come into your home unless you invite him. He can't go out in the sun because he'll burst into flames. He can't stand crosses, can't stand wolfsbane, can't stand garlic. You can kill him with a stake through the heart. Can't stand holy water. The list just goes on and on and on. But the vast majority of that was introduced by the movies. It was not in the original book. In the original book, he was just as vulnerable as any other human. The only difference was barring catastrophic accidents or murder, he wouldn't die. He would just carry on living as long as he fed on the blood of the living occasionally. So I mentioned one of the things we'd be looking out for is how does whoever goes to visit the Count cut himself? Well, in this one he doesn't. It's kind of strange. It's the only one I can think of where that has not happened. So, yeah. Now, when Dracula first takes him into the castle, this is an interesting variation. He immediately shows Harker to his room, just to where he's going to be staying, and then they go down to have dinner and go over the papers and have a nice conversation by the fire. But when Dracula takes Harker to his room, there's a huge mirror over the dresser, and Harker immediately sees that Dracula has no reflection. Like, immediately. Before they've even sat down to dinner, he knows something's up. Now, much like other versions of the story that actually do the whole Harker's Nights of Terror scenes, this one truncates everything down to a single night of absolute insane levels of terror, just rapidly escalating. So we have the whole thing where Harker basically gets locked in his room after conversing with Dracula overnight. He looks out the window. I was waiting to see if they would do the whole thing where Dracula climbs down the wall like a lizard, but alas, that is not in this one. That's another thing that I've been keeping an eye out for, because I found that kind of funny in the book, how he would just climb down the... I mean, it's his castle. Why would he not just go out the front door? Like, I don't know why. I guess because he's going out to murder people, so he has to be a little more stealthy about it. But I always found that kind of strange, that he would just kind of scuttle down the wall like a lizard. But alas, that is not in this one. Harker does climb out the window and kind of get around, and he finds his way to the crypt and collapses. I forget exactly why he collapses, but anyway, he collapses in the crypt, and then the three vampire women appear. Now, when they come out of their coffins, for some reason, they look kind of ghostly. It's just a slightly more ethereal quality to them, and they gradually solidify as they advance on him. So they go and advance on him, and they're starting to kind of put him under their spell, and then Dracula shows up and says, "No, stay away from him, he's mine." And this is something we had not seen in any version of Dracula, but it's in the book. It's quite a horrifying part of the book. Earlier, we saw a mother, distraught, pounding on the walls and windows of the castle, saying, "Give me back my baby, give me back my baby." So, cut to a little bit later, Dracula shows up with the vampire brides and shoos them away. He drops a bundle on the ground, and they say, "Is there to be nothing for us?" And he's like, "No, I brought you that." And it's an infant in the bag. So the three of them take the bag. You see some movement in the bag, and you hear the baby inside, and they take it off and eat it. Off screen, thank God, but you know what's going on, and it's pretty horrifying. But I mean, this very immediately establishes just how pure evil these creatures are. There is nothing redeemable about them. They are evil. They feed on life. They feed on innocence. They feed on fear, and they don't care who gets hurt along the way. All that matters is maintaining their own existence and providing sustenance for themselves. And that is the perfect example of that. So Dracula went out and snatched a baby from its mother and brought it back to feed the vampire women. Oh yeah, he's just totally charming, really nice guy. Let's have him around to dinner sometime. I say this in response to the later romanticized versions of Dracula that have emerged over the years, portraying him as a tragic character and such. And I suppose there are some tragic aspects to his character, but this, in terms of the characterization, is very much the Dracula from the book. He is just a being of pure evil. So Harker finds his way back to his room and wakes up, thinks maybe he just had a nightmare, checks his neck, sees that he's been bitten. So he climbs out the window again, because he's been locked in again, goes back to the crypt, needs to know if everything he saw was real or not, and he finds Dracula in his coffin. And it is exactly like it's described in the book, where his cheeks are flushed, his eyes are red. and he seems somehow renewed. And there's a little trickle of blood on his mustache. That's straight out of the book. And he just recoils in horror, and runs back out, and he can't handle all the things that he's seen this night, and in just a fit of blind panic, he throws himself out the window. Yeah, that didn't happen in the book. and this is where we begin to deviate slightly. In the book, it's kind of a cliffhanger. We don't actually know what happened to him. The last we see of Harker is he's trapped in the castle. He's a prisoner of Dracula's. And Dracula goes off to England. Harker isn't with him. So for a long time in the book, we don't know what happened to Harker. So, yeah, in this one, he throws himself out the window. And then the next thing we see, he's in the sanitarium under the care of Dr. Seward. And this is where we finally get to meet Renfield. So who is Renfield in this one? Klaus Kinski. Yes. 9 years before he would play the Count himself in the 1979 remake of Nosferatu. In this one, he is Renfield. Now, you would think, being Klaus Kinski, this is going to be the most over-the-top, just balls-out nuts version of Renfield ever. But it isn't. It's actually a very subdued portrayal of Renfield. He's very introspective and keeps to himself, and people try to interact with him, he just kind of shies away, and he has his flies. By the way, Jess Franco has said in interviews that Klaus Kinski is so method that he actually ate real flies and not fake ones. So how true that is, I don't know, but it makes for a nice little story. The other interesting thing about this version of Renfield, no dialogue. Not a single word. Not one single word of dialogue. It's actually not so much a mute performance, but just a no dialogue performance. There are scenes where he screams, he's freaking out about something. And there's a scene towards the end where Seward is trying to get Renfield to tell him what's going on. What's your connection with Dracula? Tell me. And Renfield starts to whisper in his ear, but we never actually hear what he says. So only Seward will ever know what he said. Now we should check the Lucy suitometer. So as we know, in the book, Lucy had 3 suitors. There was Arthur Holmwood, Quincy P. Morris, and Dr. John Seward. Well, Dr. Seward is in this, but he's portrayed as an older guy. He's not really suitor material. He's just, the old wizened doctor. So he's off the table. So who is her suitor of choice? Well, Arthur's not even in it, so that only leaves one, Mr. Quincy P. Morris. Yes. A lot of love for Quincy over the course of the movies, I've noticed. He appears in quite a few of them, and always in a very favorable light, which I'm okay with, because I actually really liked Quincy from the book, and I was kind of bummed that she didn't pick him, because I thought Arthur was a little too much of a stuffed shirt, but Quincy just seemed like a really nice guy, and he'd be a lot of fun to hang out with, so... honestly seemed more Lucy's type, because she was more of a free spirit kind of thing, right? Arthur seemed a little too, uptight for Lucy's type, I don't know. Anyway, so Quincy P. Morris is the suitor in this one. And not even a suitor, actually. They're full-blown engaged at the time of this story. They just don't even bother. It's like, yep, he's my fiancé. Done. Van Helsing. Van Helsing is played by the wonderful Herbert Lom, who many of you may remember as Dreyfus from the Pink Panther movies, the arch nemesis of Inspector Clouseau. Well, first his boss, and then he goes crazy, and then he becomes his arch nemesis. But yeah, so he's Van Helsing. Apparently he wasn't Jess Franco's first choice. Now get this, his first choice was Vincent Price. Can you imagine? Just picture this for a moment. Vincent Price as Van Helsing versus Christopher Lee as Dracula. How awesome would that have been? Yeah. And they would have got him. However, at the time, he was under contract to whatever studio it was he was working with at the time. And they wouldn't let him out of it. So, there you go. Obviously, Christopher Lee did not have that problem with Hammer. Hammer was, more than amicable about it. Or amicable? Not amicus, amicable. And his second choice was Dennis Price, an actor I'm not familiar with. I don't think he's related to Vincent Price, just a coincidence of name. And anyway, Herbert Lom, he was unavailable due to illness, apparently. Herbert Lom was the third choice. But, honestly, an excellent choice, because, he's a terrific actor, too. And he really has that kind of old world quality that you expect from Van Helsing. I also like, I don't know why, I like it when the Van Helsing is shorter in stature than the Dracula. I think it makes for a more, almost like a David and Goliath thing, where you have this towering, commanding presence of a Dracula and this more almost diminutive Van Helsing whose real power is his mind. And this is that type of Van Helsing, and I like that about it. So as we may expect, Lucy is Dracula's first major victim, and this also plays out much like it does in the book, where Lucy goes sleepwalking. Mina sees her and follows her. Lucy ends up going to the graveyard, and Mina actually catches sight of Dracula feeding on her. She doesn't quite see what's going on. In the book, it's all kind of in shadow, and she doesn't really get a clear look at him. This one, she gets a pretty clear look at Dracula, but for whatever reason doesn't quite put the pieces together. I guess we see him, but she doesn't, that kind of thing. So anyway, she helps Lucy get back to the house, and then Van Helsing and Dr. Seward are called in. Van Helsing in this one, by the way, runs the sanitarium. He's not a distant friend of Seward's, so they've kind of smushed things together, I guess, for time constraint reasons, just to simplify things a bit. So they come to Lucy's aid, and that's around the time that Quincy shows up, and they realize, she's lost almost all the blood in her body. She desperately needs a transfusion. So Quincy volunteers to be the subject of the transfusion. Now, in the book, the whole transfusion thing goes on over several nights, because every time they refill her blood, they try to protect her from whatever is draining her, but the next night she's drained again. So in the book, it ends up going through several people donating their blood and giving her transfusions. They didn't have anything about blood types back then. It was just blood is blood. And every time they refill her, she's drained again the next day. And Van Helsing's just like, what the hell is going on here? And finally puts the pieces together that it's a vampire. But in this case, we just have the one transfusion. Again, much like Harker's Nights of Terror, or Months of Terror is condensed down to one night. All the transfusions are condensed down to one. Because really, you don't need to have all of them. If you're doing it as a TV miniseries, fine. Do all of them, because you have the running time to play around with it. But in this case, they just do the one, and then Dracula comes to her one more time and kills her. And then, of course, she turns into a vampire. There's a creepy scene where she lures a little girl into the woods and just kind of takes her away. Very, very spooky stuff, kids. So by this point, Van Helsing is starting to put the pieces together, and he realizes that Lucy has most likely been turned into a vampire. So he and Quincy go and track her down, and Quincy has the honor of driving the stake through his fiance's heart. And we get the obligatory blood splatter on his face, too. It's one of the... I guess Hammer kind of started that, but it's nice to see that trope in full effect. So then, shortly after this, Harker's feeling better, so he's leaving the sanitarium. He catches a bit of a look at Renfield having one of his freakouts, and I don't think he really gets the connection just yet between Renfield and Dracula, but... Renfield never really leaves the sanitarium. I mean, there's some kind of... He has some kind of connection with Dracula, but you never really get sort of a definition of it. Just that he's somehow in tune with what's going on and knows what's going on. There's several scenes towards the beginning when we first, after Harker jumps out the window and we meet Renfield for the first time. There's a lot of scenes at the beginning where he's just kind of sitting in his window observing, and he sees Mina, and he sees Lucy, and he sees Dracula, and he sees all these different things going on. He's just kind of watching the world from his window. So you get the impression that he knows more than... I was going to say than he's telling, but he never speaks a word in the whole movie. So anyway, Jonathan goes and rejoins the group, and by this point, they're pretty sure that Dracula's their man. He's the vampire that they're looking for, and they decide they've obviously got to put a stop to him. So they head off to Carfax to try to track down his box of earth. They find the location where the box of earth was. They can see the markings on the ground, but the box has been moved. So they don't know where it's been moved to. Then, for some reason, there's a whole bunch of stuffed animals there, like taxidermy stuffed animals, and there's this crazy trippy scene where they're all like looking at the stuffed animals and freaking out at the stuffed animals, and oh my god, there's more stuffed animals. They're just like going nuts for these stuffed animals. And like, what is your problem? It's just some stuffed animals. You'd see them in any hunter's home or museum or what have you, and they're just freaking out. I don't remember the big stuffed animal terror scene from the book, but we'll just go with that. And then Van Helsing actually has a stroke. So then the next scene, Van Helsing is wheelchair ridden. That didn't happen in the book either. So it's basically down to Harker and Quincy to take care of business. They know what needs to be done. It's just a matter of tracking down Dracula. In the meantime, Harker suggests they go back to Dracula's castle and take care of the 3 vampire women. So they do. They go back there, they kill all 3 of them, and those are dispatched. So we actually get closure for the vampire brides. Not every movie does that. Like, I know the 1931 version didn't even go there. It's like we saw them at the beginning and we never saw them again. So then it's a matter of finding Dracula, the last vamp standing. So while Harker and Quincy are off taking care of the vampire brides, Dracula shows up and confronts Van Helsing, and they have a little confrontation there. And the one thing you notice right off the bat is, at the beginning of the movie, Dracula had gray, whitish hair, like he looked very old. Now, he looks very young. His hair is black and lustrous and youthful again, because he's been feeding, primarily on Lucy, but then also on, who knows who else. Lucy's the only one that matters, right? But it's that's straight out of the book, how his youth is gradually restored as he feeds on his victims. So he and Van Helsing have a little confrontation, and he tells him that you're very wise, you know much, but it will do you no good. Meanwhile, Mina's zonked out over on the other side of the room. Dracula goes to advance on her, because he's been working on her now since Lucy's been dispatched. And Van Helsing steps up out of his wheelchair, grabs a hot poker from the fire, and quickly scrapes a cross into the floor. It's like this flaming cross on the floor, and then Dracula's just like, ah! And then he takes off. But, so Van Helsing got his one little badass moment. It's like, it's a miracle, I can walk, and I'm fighting vampires again. So in this case, Dracula does not manage to kidnap Mina. He decides instead that he is in danger. Van Helsing's on to him. He knows that Harker and Quincy are out there hunting for him. So he decides he's going to head back to his castle in Transylvania. So much like the book, he employs some gypsies to cart him and his box back to the castle. And then we have our race, basically chasing them down to get back to the castle before sundown. Now, in this case, it's not a big, exciting chase like it is in the book and like it has been in some of the later movies. You don't get the big epic chase through Borgo Pass. No, basically, Quincy and Harker just kind of head them off. They're going through the pass, and Quincy and Harker are up at the top of the ridge, and they do the old, let's push this boulder over on them trick. Yeah, I mean, in the book, it's a big, exciting gunfight, and they're all, like, fighting each other, and Quincy gets wounded, possibly killed, and, yeah, it's very exciting. Well, in this one, they basically just drop a bunch of big rocks on them, dispatch the gypsies, and when it cuts down to the bottom, all the gypsies are perfectly placed under perfectly landed rocks, perfectly on them, perfectly. Wow, they have amazing aim, those gigantic boulders that realistically no human could have moved. But anyway, it's still daylight, so they rip off the coffin. Dracula's in there like, ah! And they drop a torch on him and set him on fire. That also is different from the book. Yeah, so in the book, there's a big chase through Borgo Pass. They dispatch the gypsies. Van Helsing is with them. He's not with them in this one. And basically, they stab him in the chest and they slit his throat. And with a Bowie knife, and that's it. That's how they kill him. So see what I mean? It's like nothing special. They literally cut his throat and stab him in the heart with just a regular knife, and he's dead. And the sun just meant he was weak enough to be vulnerable. But then we get this, cheesy scene of him on fire, and then it cuts to like a fake head melting and stuff like that, and it's kind of cool. Yeah, so obviously some deviations from the book, especially for one claiming to be the most faithful adaptation ever. I don't know why they felt the need to incapacitate Van Helsing so that after all the mystery solving he did, he's not even there for the final confrontation. But at least he got one little moment there. An interesting side note about that, by the way, apparently Herbert Lom and Christopher Lee never actually did any scenes together. So all the scenes that you see with the two of them in the same scene, their respective sides were filmed separately, and then it was all put together through the magic of editing. But they were never actually in the same room together during the whole thing. No particular reason, I guess it's just conflicting schedules or something. But yeah, so I thought that was kind of interesting because they are both such phenomenal actors. You totally believe that they're in the same room talking to each other, but they're not. They're actually not even there. But so that was kind of interesting when I found that out. One other brief technical note, which kind of surprised me actually. 1970, the movie's full frame. It's actually not widescreen. Yeah, I thought that was kind of strange. I mean, we're well into the widescreen era there, but yeah, it was a relatively low-budget production. A large percentage of it was filmed on location, so they didn't need to, build too much in the way of sets and so forth. It's really more about the strength of the performances and the parts that are accurate to the book. Like I said, I mean, there's quite a few things that are taken straight from the book, but they've definitely taken some liberties, especially during the latter half. It gets quite a bit different. I mean, yeah, the stuffed animal scene, come on, it's it's just so random. Anyway, the Blu-ray. This is a beautiful freaking Blu-ray from Severin Films. This is one of those wonderful indie labels that is basically run by fans and aficionados, so that a lot of time and care goes into every single one of their releases. So this is a terrific one. So in terms of the transfer, it looks absolutely beautiful. It is just pristine. Really, really nice job on that. I love this cover, by the way. That's just so creepy and badass and awesome. Special features. This thing is loaded. This is so loaded. Here, let me just give you a quick look at the disc art. Very nice disc art. But this is absolutely loaded with special features. Check this out. You got Cook, Vampire, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that. Vampire. Per Portabella's expressionistic behind-the-scenes feature film from 1971. So I guess a behind-the-scenes look at the making of the film. I've not watched that yet because that is 75 minutes long. That's like another movie. So very cool, very cool. I'm definitely going to enjoy checking that out. You got audio commentary with horror historian David Delval and actress Maria Rome, who plays Mina in the film, by the way. Beloved Count, an interview with director Jess Franco. I did watch that. It's quite fascinating, where he gets into the, why they did the film and sort of what he thinks of some other versions of Dracula and things like that. Handsome Harker, an interview with actor Fred Williams, who played Jonathan Harker. Stakeholders, an appreciation of Jess Franco's Dracula by filmmaker Christoph Gans. Yeah, I watched that as well. That's also quite entertaining. Very, very passionate, very... it's great when filmmakers are also fans, because then you kind of get like an added perspective, I find, because it's like you're familiar with their stuff maybe, but and they know the technique, they know the craft, they know the process. So when they're really gaga over something, it makes it that much more exciting because it's like a whole other level of appreciation. It's really interesting to see. It has the German trailer and the complete abridged 84-minute long audiobook of Dracula, read by Christopher Lee. Yes, that is freaking awesome. That is worth the price of admission alone, just to have Christopher Lee reading Dracula to you. I mean, come on. It's awesome. While I was actually setting up the rest of the Halloween set shortly, I guess towards the end of September, I put that on and I listened to the whole damn thing. I mean, it was nice, kind of as an encapsulated refresher of the story, because it just kind of has all the main stuff, cutting out all the fluff. But it was also great hearing Christopher Lee reading it, because he really gets into it. I mean, he really just put his all into it, not only doing just wonderful dramatic narration, but also really performing the characters. I mean, you almost forget that it's him as everybody, because he just does it so well. And then, in addition to that, it's also enhanced with music and sound effects. So it's a really dramatic, exciting performance of it. And I highly recommend you listen to it if you pick up this Blu-ray. It's fantastic. And honestly, for all its inconsistencies, I actually really enjoyed this a lot. I thought it had a terrific cast. Some of the silly bits towards the end weren't all that great, but the first half of it I really liked a lot. I liked some of the creative liberties, like for example having Renfield silent. I mean, that is such a daring take on Renfield, and for it to be Klaus Kinski playing a very subdued, reserved, introspective version of Renfield, that. But I guess, when you think about it, Klaus Kinski was such an unconventional actor who was in many ways a true artist, in that he would have these explosive confrontations with directors, but most of it was just because he wanted to be left the hell alone to ply his craft. Let me create, let me work on this character, and I will give you something special. And Jess Franco was a director that understood that and allowed him the opportunity to explore and to improvise and to have fun with it. And as such, it was I've not heard any stories of antagonistic temper tantrums in this one that you always hear of in Klaus Kinski films, but not in this one. Just something about them clicked. They just, they knew how to relate to each other. And it's pretty interesting. Anyway, definitely recommended. Check it out. Really good stuff. And an interesting alternative Dracula to the Hammer version, which Christopher Lee had played for so many years. He would still do a couple more Hammer films after this, but this was pretty much when he was just about done with them, because they had strayed so far from the core Dracula character and tone and everything, that he was just getting tired of it. But this came along at a pretty good time, actually, I think, for them to be able to get him, because he was already feeling kind of weary of the direction that the Hammer films had gone. Alrighty, that is it from me to you for now. Hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time. So until then, thanks for watching. Big thanks to my Patreon sponsors, and sayonara.